Through Outlaw's history, Riot has never really wanted players to master the game. Because if you master the game, then it's kind of like beating it in a sense, right? Like you made it 100% through the entire save file. So there's nothing more for you to learn within the game. And that's also why League of Legends is a great game itself, is because you can almost never truly master the game because it's shifting so much over and over again to where you need to learn new skills in order to then once again try and become perfect at the game. And so the greatest skill that any player can ever have within League of Legends itself is adaptation. Like essentially League of Legends is like Darwinism on fucking crack, right? It's just, that's the pure and ultimate tenet that you can see throughout every iteration of League of Legends, through major patch changes or major metas or seasons, right? Is that adaptation, if you are a person that is very adaptable, then you will succeed in some fashion or another within League of Legends. It may not be your particular meta in which you will perform 100% optimally, but if you're able to adapt enough, you can exist throughout the entire longevity of the game. And this is especially true for pro players, even more so than anyone else, right? But that becomes a very difficult skill if you have to reshape exactly how you think about League of Legends as a game every single year, or even more so every half of a year, right? So the main tenet across multiple different esports, of course, is consistency. And yet Riot has shattered this multiple times in terms of how they judge themselves during consistency, other than constantly changing the fucking game, right? So in essence, they do this though because they need large different chunks of different content because of the main populace. Just in general, gamers, they have a short attention span, right? It's, you want to always be playing the new hotness, and if that happens to be like this stale old League of Legends game that never changes, it's eventually gonna die out like every other game has gone out before it, right? Because they didn't change enough. And the revolution of games themselves came about when essentially publishers were allowed to send patches over the internet, right? To actually update their game. Because back in the day, it was once you shipped a CD-ROM, then that was it. That was the fucking game. There were no updates at all. You could not update your game. It was embedded within the CD itself. So there was no way to actually update the game at all. So now we're in this different phase to where publisher or gaming companies have taken advantage of being able to do over-the-air updates to where now they can change their game and morph it into something that is appealing to the main audience, which constantly changes over and over again, especially as people get older and older, right? So this entire idea is me criticizing Riot from a pure esports / competitive standpoint. Really, I don't care about the casual side of League of Legends itself. So there's that aspect, but this entire idea of Riot changing the game quite frequently is especially true during the early seasons when they would release a champion every other patch. Just imagine that you had to figure out 5 new skills or 4 new skills from a champion. Well, I guess they're passive as well too. So that's a lot of information every other patch, along with item changes constantly and balancing updates constantly of all the other old champions. And it becomes a burden of knowledge, or a burden to gain that knowledge as a player, right? And so they ended up slowing that down, thankfully, to where now it's maybe 3 new champions, 4 new champions every year. And then, of course, they have the reworks of like 4 other champions. So you get like 8 total, new champions each year, which is a more slower pace, and it allows for players to actually master those particular champions given a decent amount of time frame, which is quite nice, right? And because also Riot runs into the problem of there being an exacerbated kind of exponential curve when it comes to problems that they can run into in the game just when coding it, because there's so many fucking champions and there's so many items in the game. So it just becomes more and more difficult for them to add something into that entire universe as time goes on, right? And then you had the points in which Riot would patch the game before Worlds, right? The biggest tournament of the entire year, right? Because Riot, they ended up wanting a structure of leagues and running a league structure for all of their major regions. And so all the other tournaments were pretty much irrelevant, right? Even when we had the IEMs and shit back in the day, they were largely irrelevant because they didn't add up to the circuit points of the major tournament, which was Worlds, right? And in Counter-Strike, of course, you have four, I believe it's four now, majors per year, right? And all the minors lead up to all those different majors. And so the great thing about that system is that there are 4 different points within the year to where you could say this was the best team of the year. Well, it's not really the case for League of Legends. It's because of the culmination and aspect of Riot actually putting emphasis on mainly just Worlds and kind of a subsidiary MSI. But other than that, there's nothing else that really fucking matters in this. So, as a side point. Now, the Juggernaut patch comes to mind, especially when we're looking at patches which completely fucked up the Worlds experience entirely, because this patch essentially made it to where everything that you practiced as a professional League of Legends team was somewhat irrelevant because the game just drastically changed beforehand. And this was also true of the lane swap meta, which fucked over Fnatic in 2015, because they were the best team in the world when it came to doing and executing a lane swap, which was, of course, if you're a newer player, it was essentially you would put your top laner in bot lane and your bot lane in top. And this was also because you wanted to try and dodge a particular bad matchup of either the top laner or the bot lane had a bad matchup against the opposing team. So you would do this, and of course there was no tower fortification during this time, so that made it actually possible to do this. So they completely fucked over Fnatic's chances to win Worlds during that time, and so it completely just undermined what they had created in the beginning when it came to a competitive esports structure itself. And it put this unrealistic expectation for these teams to adapt or die, which at some point it becomes ridiculous to expect that of someone. So Riot did, in fact, keep their promise to not substantially patch the game after about 2017 when the Ardent Sensor meta was prevalent. And that was when, of course, Ardent Sensor became very strong and it got into Worlds. And so Riot was like, well, we can't change it now or else then we change fundamentally how teams play. And this was the first time in which Riot conscientiously decided that the adapt or die standpoint had to stop at some point, which is a great shift into them respecting the idea of mastering the game to some extent. But back in the day, back in like StarCraft days, Blizzard really didn't patch the game that frequently, which allowed players to figure out the game on their own and at a much more methodical pace. And that was the same thing for Counter-Strike as well too. So there are other gaming companies that have decided that they didn't want to force onto the populace how they wanted the game to play out. And that's what Riot does in a sense when they don't respect the idea of mastery, is that they push the game to a particular type of meta or narrative that they want to accomplish. And this was pretty evident too with their kind of recent changes of having the game at a faster pace, right? So they added all these different elements in order to increase the pace of the game. And so that dictated whatever flow that they wanted the game to have. they didn't allow the players to actually figure out how to achieve that product by themselves. They just thought, well, everyone's going to stick into the same process of how to play the game, which was drawn out, late game, get to the late game, you do a team fight, hopefully you win the team fight. So the great thing about the other game, Counter-Strike, is that it's rarely updated, and that allows for players to truly master the game. And that's what I love about it when it comes to the esports aspect, because it gives longevity to a lot of the legendary players that still currently play the game today. You know, you have Get Right, super famous, Fallen, you know, one of the best oppers in the world, Neo, really great leader, and has been playing the game for God knows how long. This guy's like 35 years old, I think. And so all of these players stayed at the top for long points of the game, mastering the game. And it was only possible because Valve decided to not actually update the game so frequently and so drastically to where their skills were no longer relevant and they had to completely reinvent themselves. And so then you go to our example of our greatest player in League of Legends, which is Faker. But Faker is such a bizarre anomaly because the game is based upon adaptation, right? But this guy just has an uncanny ability to learn. That is probably one of his best skills as a League of Legends player, is to learn. And I would even say his natural characteristics as a person allows him to do this. Otherwise, I don't think he would be the greatest player of all time, right? And you can even catch glimpses of this from at least an English perspective, right? So I don't have all the knowledge of, you know, him interacting within the public sphere, but based upon his love of reading books, Faker is really well known of just reading books in his spare time and learning new skills or new ideas, which almost have nothing to do with gaming itself. So he has this propensity to learn. And I think that's been one of his greatest attributes when it comes to being the best League of Legends player, is that he's able to adapt, right? So there's an excitement of a player / team cracking the code of a meta, but we really never get that in LoL to the extreme. That's something that never really happens to an extent because Riot just doesn't give the time in order to allow a team to crack the meta. Or if they do, then it suddenly shifts and things are thrown into whack once again. So their advantage was never truly understood when it came to what they had discovered. And this is, of course, like you can see throughout time that there were great teams that never truly won worlds or never really won a multitude of tournaments because of this. Like Moscow 5 famously didn't win, right? And yet they were some of the biggest innovators in the world, right? Diamond Prox obviously was the innovator of counter jungling, and yet even with that advantage itself, he wasn't able to win because Moscow 5 wasn't able to adapt, and they weren't able to actually take down, you know, Taipei Assassins or anyone else in that tournament that ended up besting them, right? So sadly, every Worlds feels like it's a race for each team to crack the meta, right? Because when they get into Worlds, suddenly it's an entirely new, different meta. And it's also the fact that since League of Legends is a truly global game, that means, and it's a segregated game as well too, because there are different leagues, right? There's a North American league all off on its own. There's a European league all off on its own. And so all these different leagues are segregated into where they come to one culminating point or one melting pot, which happens to be Worlds, and all these styles clash together, which then develops a new meta. But not only that, Riot themselves feel the need to still change the game as all these metas are clashing. So really, you wouldn't even know which meta would prevail or what new ideas would come about, regardless of if they were to change the fucking game or not. And so it's come to this point where each region or team is developing their own meta and challenging that across the international stage. but it's still dependent on the tweaks and adaptation to learn the actual meta champions that Riot have tweaked in order to kind of balance out the game and how they want the game to play out itself. So LoL is just more about adaptation than it is mastery, and we'll never truly know what team during which iteration of history was truly the best, because the meta changed so rapidly and we never got to see excellence play out to its true form, which is the saddest thing. There's something amazing. There's something about watching people display their full capability, their absolute extent of mastery itself at their profession. And as we stare in awe, inspired by the sheer gap that can almost never be shored up because of the vast amount of time that it takes to just catch up to that. And to some extent, that is true with League of Legends, but not to the same degree as other sports or even games. And for that, I'm disappointed. I'm disappointed that we may never see a true master at their craft, because it has been cut short due to an ever-changing game, right? Which doesn't truly reward a player for that is ultimately dedicated to a mindset that only a few champions are capable of, right? So mastery is never truly attained in League of Legends, and I think that is the saddest reality of this esport itself.